The sun was setting low over the cracked Arizona desert when Clara learned that her life was no longer her own. The sky glowed a bruised orange as the last wagons rolled out of the small settlement she had been forced to call home. For years she had believed her uncle's cruelty was the worst fate she would ever endure, but she was wrong. That evening he made a choice that carved a deeper scar than any blow he had ever struck. He traded her. He had done many hateful things, yet the sight of his rough hand gripping her arm while he pulled her toward the edge of the settlement felt different. This time there was no lecture or drunken rage. This time he was calm, as though her fate had already been sealed long before she knew it. Clara struggled, but her arm was thin and weak from months of hunger, and her uncle's fingers dug into her skin as he dragged her forward, waiting. At the outskirts stood a tall Apache warrior she had never seen before. He was still like a cliff against the darkening sky, and his eyes watched her with a focus that made her breath falter. His name whispered through the settlement with fear, Coda. Some called him ruthless. Others called him a protector, but no one doubted his power. He wore no expression as her uncle shoved her toward him, only the faint lift of a brow as if assessing a horse he was considering purchasing her. Uncle lifted his chin and spoke in a hard, greedy voice. He said she was young, healthy, and obedient, a lie they both knew too well. Clara stared at him, her stomach twisting. She wanted to scream, yet she knew it would do nothing. The trade was not a question, it was already done. In exchange for a sack of supplies and coin, she was handed over like livestock. Coda's gaze lowered to her wrists where faint bruises marked old punishments. He did not touch her, not yet. Instead, he spoke quietly in a voice so deep she felt it rather than heard it. He told her in his language that she would come with him. The tone held no cruelty, only certainty, and she sensed fighting would be useless. Fear surged through her anyway. Leaving the settlement meant leaving behind the last flicker of familiarity, even if it had been a cage. Her uncle gave her one last look, satisfied with his bargain, and turned away without a word. He did not say goodbye. He did not ask if she would survive. Clara watched his figure fade into the dusty town and felt a strange hollowing ache in her chest. Even hate was a kind of connection, and now she had been cut loose from it. Coda finally stepped closer, and she caught the scent of smoke and wind clinging to him. His presence was commanding, but not wild, not unhinged the way settlers always described Apache warriors. He handed her a waterskin and motioned for her to drink. Confusion flickered through her, but she obeyed, and the cool liquid steadied her trembling breaths. Coda then gestured to his horse, a powerful black stallion with eyes full of warning. He swung up first and reached a hand down to her, silently inviting her to climb behind him. Clara hesitated. Riding with a stranger was frightening enough. Riding with a man who now technically owned her twisted her stomach even tighter. But the settlement was shrinking behind them, and there was nowhere else to run. She placed her foot in the stirrup and felt his strong arm steady her as she mounted the horse. The moment she settled behind him, she felt his warmth through his deerskin shirt. Her heartbeat stumbled. The horse began moving into the desert, and Clara held on to the back of Coda's belt, feeling the raw power of both rider and animal. The wind lifted her hair and carried away the last traces of her old life. She looked over her shoulder once more, seeing the sagging tents and the flickering lanterns of the settlement. She had never loved that place, but it was all she had ever known. Now it was gone, replaced by endless open-land shadows of distant cliffs, and the steady rhythm of Coda's breathing in front of her night crept in with its cool hush. Clara shivered, and Coda noticed. Without speaking, he shifted his blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders, his hand brushing her arm with unexpected gentleness. She stiffened, unsure what to make of the gesture. She waited for him to say something threatening or cruel, yet he remained silent, guiding the horse deeper into the wilderness as if he alone knew the road her life was meant to follow. Now her fear did not vanish, but something strange stirred beneath it. Curiosity maybe, or a reluctant sense of safety. She did not trust him, but she could not deny the truth that sank slowly into her heart. Whatever awaited her with Coda was different from the pain she had known. She sensed that her life had shifted, and she could not turn back the desert night wrapped around Clara and Coda as they traveled farther from the settlement than she had ever dared to go. The land ahead stretched endlessly, shaped by moonlit ridges and the distant silhouettes of mountains. The rhythm of the stallion beneath them was steady like a drum, guiding her into a future she did not choose, yet could not escape. Clara clung to the back of Coda's belt because the horse was swift and the ground uneven, but each time her fingers brushed his waist, she felt a rush of warmth that confused her more than the dark itself. For the first hour she expected harshness. She expected commands shouted at her or a warning of what her new life would be. But Coda rode in silence like a man who did not waste breath on needless words. His shoulders were broad and unmoving, and his posture straight even as the wind tried to bend him. Clara wondered if he was angry or simply distant. She wondered, too, whether he regretted the trade or saw her as nothing more than an object he had acquired. The silence grew so deep that Clara's thoughts had nowhere to hide. She kept remembering the moment her uncle shoved her forward as if she were cargo. Shame burned hot under her skin. But the shame was not because Coda now held her fate. It was because her own blood had treated her so cheaply. She pressed her cheek to her shoulder, trying to keep tears from spilling. She did not want her new owner to hear her crying. At one point the horse slowed, and Coda lifted a hand signaling for a stop. He dismounted in one smooth motion and turned to help her down. His hands were large and warm as they gripped her waist, lowering her gently to the ground. She inhaled sharply as her boots touched the sand, surprised by the tenderness in his touch. She expected him to push her or bind her or order her to walk behind him. But he simply stepped back and studied the horizon. He lifted his chin and listened to the night. Clara realized he was not pausing for rest, but checking for danger. Coyotes, rival warriors, patrols from the nearby fort, anything lurking unseen. The idea that he was protecting her unsettled her even more than the idea of being owned. Why would he care whether she survived the night? When he finally faced her again, his gaze swept over her face and then her shivering arms. Without a word, he reached into the saddlebag and pulled out another blanket. He draped it around her shoulders himself. The gesture was so gentle she almost pushed him away because kindness from him felt more dangerous than cruelty. She did not know what he wanted in return. She did not know what these silent kindnesses would cost her. They camped near a small cluster of rocks that shielded them from the wind. Coda built a small fire with quick, deliberate movements, and Clara watched him from a careful distance. His face flickered in the firelight. Strong cheekbones, dark eyes that reflected the flames, and a quiet intensity that made him seem carved by the land itself. He offered her a portion of dried meat, and she accepted even though her stomach was twisted in knots. As they ate, she expected him to speak at last. Maybe he would explain why he took her. Maybe he would tell her what he planned to do with her. But he said nothing. Instead, he rose and walked to the edge of the camp, scanning the desert again. Clara wrapped the blanket tighter around herself, feeling both safe and exposed under his watch. When he returned, he sat opposite her, which surprised her again. If he wanted to intimidate her, he would sit beside her or loom over her. Instead, he gave her space. It confused her so much she made the mistake of asking a question, her voice barely above a whisper. She asked what he intended for her now. Coda looked up slowly, and the firelight caught the faintest shift in his expression. Not anger, not desire, not pity. Something quieter. He answered in a low, steady tone, saying that she would ride with him to his homeland and that no one would harm her there. His voice held a weight that made her chest tighten. It was not a threat, it was a vow. She did not know if she believed him yet. When he lay down several feet away from her, back turned in respectful distance, a new feeling crept into her heart. She lay awake listening to the crackling fire and to the steady, even breath of the Apache warrior who now guided her fate. Fear remained, but so did a strange, unexpected comfort. She realized then that her new life had begun, and nothing about it was simple. By the fourth night, the desert had stretched into an endless expanse of shadows and starlight. Clara had learned the rhythm of the horse, the way Coda moved with the land, the silence that carried both danger and comfort. Her fear had not vanished, fear never fully left her, but she had begun to understand the strange balance of power and protection in this warrior who now held her fate. She had not yet spoken a word about her own feelings, and Coda had not pressed her either. It was as if the tension between them was a language neither needed to name that night. After the fire had burned low and the wind whispered between the jagged rocks, Clara shivered despite the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Coda noticed immediately. He leaned closer, his presence a slow wave of heat and authority, and draped the blanket tighter. His hand brushed against her arm in a touch that was deliberate, gentle, and charged with a quiet intensity. She froze, heart hammering in a way that scared and thrilled her. He leaned down, and she caught the scent of smoke and desert wind mixed with something more subtle, something uniquely him. She could not name it yet, could only feel it in the shiver that ran through her body. And then, almost without warning, he spoke. His voice was a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the desert itself. "Make love to me every day, and you will never suffer again." The words struck her like a lightning bolt, shocking her blood, her mind, every thought she had held onto for safety and control. Her first instinct was to recoil, to shout, to demand that he had no right to speak like that. But the sound of his voice, the depth of it, the way he said it as though it were not a command but a truth, rooted her to the spot. He did not touch her in that moment, did not force her hand or body, and yet the weight of the whisper was more binding than chains Clara's mind spun. How could a man she barely knew speak of such things as if they were inevitable? She could not imagine being claimed in this way, in a way that made her body respond before her mind could protest. And yet, as she sat there with the desert wind cutting across her skin, she realized that the hunger stirring inside her was undeniable. It was a hunger that terrified her more than the thought of ownership ever had. She tried to speak, tried to push back the emotions rising like wildfire, but her voice failed. Coda saw her struggle, his dark eyes softening for the briefest moment. He did not press, did not lean closer, did not smile. He simply watched her, waiting, letting her feel the weight of choice she had never truly had before. In that pause, Clara understood something profound. He was not cruel. He was not demanding in the way she had feared. He was offering her something, a dangerous promise that her life could be different if she surrendered. Not just to him, but to the fire he ignited inside her. She looked at him, searching his face for any hint of deception, and saw only honesty. A fierce protection that went beyond words or ownership. He wanted her to understand, to feel, to accept the life that was unfolding. The whisper was more than desire. It was a covenant, a boundary, a warning, and an invitation all at once. Her hand shook. Her chest tightened, but she also felt a strange release. For the first time since her uncle's betrayal, she sensed that there might be a man in the world who could see her not merely as property, but as a being capable of love, desire, and connection. The paradox terrified her and tempted her in equal measure. Coda straightened slightly and looked past her to the fire, to the stars, to the endless desert ahead. Clara could not move her gaze from him. She realized that the words had shifted something inside her, had cracked the wall she had built to survive. She was no longer just afraid. She was drawn to him, pulled into the orbit of a man who could be her captor or her salvation, her torment or her desire. That night she did not sleep, not fully. She lay curled beneath the blanket he had wrapped around her, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, feeling the heat from his body even at a distance. The whisper echoed in her mind, a promise she did not yet understand, a danger she could not resist. The desert night stretched endlessly, and Clara knew that everything she had known before was gone. The life she feared had just begun. And Coda's words haunted her more than any chain, any whip, any betrayal ever could. The sun rose behind the distant cliffs, spilling gold and crimson across the desert as Clara and Coda approached the hidden Apache village. It was tucked deep in a canyon, shielded by jagged rocks and the natural walls of the land. Smoke curled gently from the small homes, the scent of cooking fires and baked corn drifting across the morning air. To Clara, it looked like another world, one alive and vibrant yet entirely foreign. She swallowed the lump in her throat. The settlement she had been stolen from had been cruel, but at least it was known. Here, she was truly alone, surrounded by strangers whose eyes measured her every step. The first to notice her were the children. Curious and cautious, peeking from behind corners and the woven hides of the dwellings. Their small hands clutched their mother's skirts as Coda led her into the village. Their gazes were sharp, almost too knowing for their age, and Clara felt exposed in a way she had never experienced. She was a stranger, a newcomer, a woman who carried the weight of the outside world. And yet she could not deny the flicker of fascination in some of the children's eyes, a spark of something like wonder. The adults were different. Some watched with suspicion, especially the older women who had known Coda for decades. Their eyes narrowed, lips pressed tight as if weighing the danger and the value of this girl who had been brought into their midst. Clara could feel the tension coil in the air. She sensed that Coda's reputation as a warrior, a man who claimed what he wanted, preceded him. But this was more than fear. This was judgment. They were deciding whether she would strengthen him or weaken him. Coda moved with quiet authority, leading her through the village without a word to anyone. He introduced her to no one, yet his presence spoke for itself. Clara walked close behind him, noting the way people stepped aside, their hands lightly touching the edges of their children as if to shield them. Even in silence, Coda commanded respect. Clara felt the weight of their eyes like a pressing wind, felt her pulse quicken, and wondered what life would demand of her. Here she tried to meet the gazes of some villagers, to show she was not a threat, not weak, not someone to be dismissed entirely. But her training in fear and survival made her cautious, hesitant. Every glance from an elder, every whisper of the wind through the village, reminded her that she was being measured, judged, claimed in ways she had never known. She had been owned by Coda in the desert, yes, but now the entire community watched her, as if her worth was being tested before the very air she breathed that evening. As the sun dipped behind the canyon walls, the village gathered quietly for a communal meal. Clara sat a respectful distance from the fire, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her hands clenched in her lap. Coda remained nearby, sometimes catching her gaze, sometimes scanning the shadows beyond the village. The children dared to approach, offering small gifts of wild berries, curious about the stranger who had come riding into their canyon. Clara accepted them hesitantly, her fingers brushing theirs, feeling warmth and connection for the first time in days. Coda, however, said nothing, and his silence was more commanding than any words could be. He did not explain her place here or the customs she would need to follow. Instead, he allowed her to observe, to learn, to absorb the rhythms of life she had never known. And in that observation, Clara began to notice the subtle kindnesses that surrounded her. The way an elder's hand lingered on a child's shoulder, the way Coda's warriors moved with quiet precision, and how the community, though wary, had an unspoken cohesion as night fell. Clara lay on a simple mat in the small space Coda had given her. The village was quiet, save for distant laughter of children and the soft murmurs of fire. She listened, thinking of the whispers that had carried across the desert the night before. Coda's promise, the one that made her heart race and tremble, hung in her mind. She felt the tension between fear and desire tightening, and knew that this new life, though frightening, offered something she had never known, the chance to belong, the chance to survive, and perhaps the chance to choose. Clara understood that her life had changed forever. The Apache village would be her home for now, its people her judges, and Coda, the man who had claimed her in the desert, both her protector and the one who stirred emotions she could not yet name. The eyes of the village would watch her every step. Yet it was Coda's eyes she could not forget, the whisper she could not silence, the promise that burned hotter than fear, and for the first time she felt the strange mixture of hope and dread that comes with knowing you are no longer alone, but no longer free. The days in the Apache village passed with a rhythm Clara had never experienced before. She awoke to the rising sun, the smell of fire and bread, the calls of children weaving through the canyon. Coda's presence was constant yet measured. He did not smother her, did not demand obedience beyond what was necessary. And yet every glance from him carried weight, every slight touch of his hand a reminder that he owned more than just her body. He owned her attention, her heart, and her fear. Clara found herself walking a tightrope between rebellion and surrender, between anger at her stolen freedom and fascination with the man who had taken it one afternoon. A sudden rainstorm swept through the canyon. The sky turned dark as clouds rolled in, lightning flickering across the ridges, thunder rattling the wooden frames of the village. Clara had sought shelter under a small awning, trying to keep her clothes dry, and Coda appeared beside her, pulling a large hide over them both. The brush of his arm against hers sent a shiver through her, and she wanted to step away but found herself rooted in place. He said nothing, simply held the hide tight against them, shielding her from the storm. The silence between them was heavier than words, filled with tension, possibility, and a strange comfort she could not deny that evening. After the storm had passed and the canyon sparkled with wet stones and dripping leaves, Coda finally spoke. He asked her if she was hungry and gestured for her to follow. They walked to a quiet corner of the village near a small fire pit where he had arranged a meal. He had prepared the food himself, simple and hearty, but the care in its preparation stunned Clara. His fingers brushed hers as he handed her a piece of bread, and she felt her breath catch. She wanted to pull away, to assert herself, but could not resist the magnetic pull of his gaze, the quiet dominance in the way he moved when she finally dared to look up fully. She saw a flicker of something in Coda's eyes, something different from the hard, controlled warrior she had first met in the desert. There was concern, protectiveness, even tenderness. It was as if he wanted to reassure her without speaking, wanted to show her that the life he had brought her into, terrifying as it was, could also hold safety, pleasure, and desire. Clara felt a sudden, confusing surge of warmth, a recognition that this man, this fierce warrior who could command storms and men alike, could also touch her in ways she had never imagined. That night, when the village had quieted and most of the families retired to their own spaces, Coda approached Clara's small mat. He did not come with force, did not demand her. Instead, he knelt near the edge, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, far enough that she could still retreat. He spoke softly, almost a whisper, telling her to rest, to sleep, to trust. She realized then that he had been watching her closely for days, learning her fears, her hesitations, the way her body responded to touch, to proximity, to his presence. He understood her better than she understood herself. Clara felt her defenses crumble, slowly, tentatively. The fear of being claimed shifted into something more complex, something dangerous. She wanted him to draw closer, yet feared the surrender it would demand. Every fiber of her being reacted to him, the smell of him, the sound of his voice, the strength in his hands and arms. She realized that desire and fear could coexist, that she could be afraid of losing herself and yet long to lose herself completely. Coda's gentle claim was more powerful than force. He did not need to dominate her with words or actions. He simply existed with a presence that demanded attention, respect, and ultimately, desire. When he finally leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face, Clara's breath caught. She did not pull away. She did not speak. She simply let herself feel the pull of him, the electricity that passed between them. The knowledge that her body and heart were no longer her own alone. By the time he withdrew slightly, letting her space to breathe, Clara realized she had crossed a threshold. Fear still lingered, but it was entwined with fascination, longing, and a spark of hope she could not have imagined in the settlement she had left behind. Coda's gentle claim was no threat. It was an invitation, a promise that her life, though stolen, might also be filled with moments of desire, tenderness, and connection she had never thought possible that night. As she lay beneath the stars and the protective shadow of the canyon walls, Clara understood the truth. Her body, her mind, and her heart had begun to belong to Coda, not merely because he had claimed her, but because he had earned a space within her that no fear, no anger, and no past cruelty could erase. She drifted to sleep with her pulse still racing, the memory of his touch lingering like fire in her veins, and a strange certainty that nothing, no storm, no judgment, no battle would break the bond that had begun to form between them. The canyon nights were alive with the distant calls of owls, the rustle of leaves, and the low whisper of wind threading between the rocks. Clara had begun to settle into the rhythm of life in the Apache village, yet she remained a stranger in a world that both fascinated and terrified her. She learned the tasks of the day, helped with chores, and observed Coda's people with wide eyes, noting the careful balance of strength and respect that guided every movement. But no matter how absorbed she became in the village, her thoughts always drifted back to Coda, to the fire of desire he ignited, to the whisper that had shaken her from the very first night in the desert till it was on the 5th night in the village, beneath a sky smeared with stars, that the tension she had been holding finally erupted. They sat together near a quiet stream, water reflecting the moonlight like shards of silver. Coda's presence was constant, the warmth of him brushing against her shoulder every time he moved. Clara's pulse thudded in her chest as she realized that the quiet moments of daily life had been building toward this, a storm of longing, curiosity, and fear. Coda glanced at her, eyes dark and unreadable. He said nothing at first, but the intensity in his gaze was enough to make her breath catch. Then, almost imperceptibly, he shifted closer, his hand lightly brushing hers. The touch was electric. Clara's mind screamed that she should pull away, that the power imbalance should terrify her, but her body betrayed her. Every nerve seemed alive, every inch of her skin attuned to the presence of this man who owned her fate. "Clara," he said finally, voice low and rough, "you do not have to fear me. Not here, not now." The words wrapped around her like a promise, but also a challenge. She had feared him, feared what it meant to be his, feared the judgment of the village, and yet that fear now coexisted with something she had never known: desire. Desire so raw it made her tremble, and longing so consuming it left her dizzy. Her lips parted instinctively, and she felt the heat in her chest, the pull of something dangerous and irresistible. They spent the evening in silence, sitting by the water, yet every glance, every small touch, every shift of their bodies spoke volumes. Clara realized she was learning Coda's rhythms, the way he measured distance and attention, the way he could communicate entire emotions without a single word. And slowly, tentatively, she began to reach toward him, not in obedience, but in choice. Her hand brushed his, lingered, and he did not pull away. Instead, he let her guide the moment, letting her understand that surrender and desire could coexist. The next days were a careful dance, between restraint and temptation. Clara found herself drawn to Coda in ways she could not articulate, in ways that frightened her and thrilled her at the same time. He allowed her space to acclimate, to explore, yet the tension between them was impossible to ignore. Every glance from him, every brush of his arm against hers, carried an unspoken question, a challenge, a warning. The villagers watched, sensing the bond forming, whispering quietly. But Coda's authority and Clara's growing willingness made the judgments fade into the background by nightfall. Their moments together became more charged, more deliberate. Coda taught her to read the desert, to sense danger, to move silently. Yet always his hands and presence reminded her that she was his in ways the village had yet to understand. Clara found herself responding with an eagerness she had never known, her body betraying the fear she tried to maintain. And the tension between them built like the approaching roar of a storm. It was during one quiet night, with the moon reflecting off the stream, that Clara finally realized the truth. She wanted him. Not merely because he had claimed her, not merely because he had power, but because he had shown her tenderness, protection, and a kind of desire that was consuming and raw. And Coda, reading her silence, leaned closer, brushing her hair back, whispering words that made her shiver with anticipation and understanding. Desire bound them together, stronger than fear, stronger than judgment. Binding two worlds, the wild, unyielding desert and the fragile human heart, into a single pulse of longing that night, Clara understood that there was no turning back. She was learning the power of surrender, of choice, and of passion that could not be denied. And as Coda held her near the stream, letting the cool water wash over their feet and the stars witness their closeness, she knew that the bond forming between them was more dangerous, more consuming, and more beautiful than anything she had ever imagined. The tranquility of the Apache village could not last forever. News traveled faster than the wind through the canyon, and rumors of Clara's presence reached the nearby cavalry fort. Some settlers had discovered that she had been taken by Coda, and they viewed the situation as a crime demanding justice. Clara had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the village, to the warmth of Coda's presence, and to the quiet tension of desire and respect. But now a storm approached that neither she nor Coda could avoid. The first sign came with the distant thunder of hooves against stone and dust. Clara had been helping with the evening meal when Coda's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. He did not speak immediately, but the tension in his shoulders told her everything. She felt a familiar knot of fear twist inside her, sharper than any she had experienced in the desert. Coda had protected her from so much already, yet this threat carried the weight of more than just danger. It carried the possibility of losing him, of being torn away from the man whose whisper still burned in her mind and body. Cavalry patrol appeared as the sun dipped behind the canyon walls. Uniforms glinting, rifles raised, commands shouted. Clara froze, caught between fear and instinct. She wanted to run, to hide, but she realized there was nowhere to go. Coda moved like a shadow, his figure tall and unyielding as he stepped in front of her. His hand brushed her arm, a grounding touch that told her to stay calm, that he would protect her. Her pulse raced, but she found a strange strength in his presence. She could not fight as he did, but she could stand. And she could choose. The soldiers demanded Clara's release, their voices sharp and unrelenting. Coda's response was calm but deadly, a low growl that carried through the canyon like rolling thunder. He did not threaten her. He threatened those who would harm her. He positioned himself between her and the rifles, his eyes blazing, his hand steady on his weapon. Clara realized in that moment that the man who had whispered to her in the desert was now ready to risk everything for her safety. Fear mingled with awe and desire, and she felt tears sting her eyes. Not from helplessness, but from recognition of the depth of his claim to her. One soldier stepped forward, rifle aimed directly at Coda. Clara's instincts screamed to push him away, to protect the man who had saved her from despair and desire alike. She stepped forward, placing herself between Coda and the soldier. Her heart pounded, but there was a clarity in her mind. This was her choice, her declaration, the first of many that would define the woman she was becoming in the canyon. She refused to be merely a prize or a pawn. She would fight for him, in whatever small way she could. Coda's eyes softened briefly as he glanced at her. He knew the courage it took for her to stand there. It was not brute strength, but it was bravery born of love, of attachment, of desire mingled with survival. The soldiers hesitated, reading the bond between Clara and the warrior, and for a moment the canyon held its breath. Then, with a command sharp and absolute, Coda signaled to his warriors hidden in the rocks, ready for a fight if it came. The patrol faltered, realizing that this was no ordinary village, no ordinary man. They were met with the silent, deadly threat of the Apache warriors, and the calculus of violence shifted. Clara stood her ground, feeling the tension vibrate through her every nerve. She understood the danger, but also the unspoken truth. She belonged here now, to this man who had claimed her, and she would not be taken from him. Every instinct of survival aligned with the strange and consuming passion that had begun in the desert. She felt her body and heart resonate with his strength, his protection, his desire. Fear was still there, but it had been transformed into a bond that could not be broken by threats or rifles or the judgment of outsiders. When the soldiers finally retreated, beaten by fear, caution, and the undeniable claim of Coda's authority, Clara exhaled, trembling but unbroken. Coda reached for her hand, the contact light but grounding, and she allowed herself to lean into him. The danger had passed, but the memory of it burned hot in her chest. She realized that their bond was now tested not only by passion but by blood, by the world beyond the canyon, by those who would never understand the depths of what they shared that night. As the canyon settled into quiet again, Clara lay next to Coda, her body pressed to his for warmth and reassurance. She understood the truth of his whisper in the desert. To be with him was to surrender, but surrender did not mean weakness. It meant survival, it meant desire, it meant a connection fierce enough to face any threat the world might bring. And she knew, as she closed her eyes beside the warrior who had claimed her entirely, that nothing, no soldier, no settlement, no fear could sever the bond that now defined their lives. The canyon lay quiet under the first light of dawn, a fragile calm that seemed almost impossible after the chaos of the previous night. Clara woke to the warmth of Coda beside her, the soft weight of his arm across her shoulders, a reminder that she was no longer alone, no longer merely a pawn in someone else's cruelty. She traced the lines of his face in the dim light, memorizing the strength and intensity that had captivated her from the very first moment they met in the desert. He was both a protector and a fire she could not resist, and the truth of their bond pulsed through her as vividly as the river that carved the canyon walls. Coda stirred, his dark eyes opening to meet hers. There was no question in his gaze, no doubt, only a steady affirmation that she belonged to him, and perhaps even more terrifying and thrilling, that he belonged to her. Clara had learned over the weeks that ownership was not merely about control or possession, it was about trust, intimacy, and surrender. The whispered promise he had made in the desert was now no longer a whisper, but a tangible reality that shaped every heartbeat. Every breath, every pulse of their lives. The village around them had returned to its rhythm. The children laughing quietly, elders moving with measured steps, and the warriors tending to their duties with watchful eyes. Yet Clara knew that the world beyond these canyon walls remained unpredictable, and that their love, dangerous as it was, required constant courage. Coda did not speak immediately. He simply held her, the silence heavy with meaning. Finally, his voice, low and unyielding, broke through the quiet. "You are mine," he said, but there was no harshness in the words. Not by force, not by fear, but by choice. And if you will it, I am yours in every way. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, a mixture of relief, desire, and awe. She realized that this was the moment she had longed for without understanding it, the moment when fear, desire, and loyalty converged. She stepped closer, placing her hand over his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heart. Her whisper trembled yet carried conviction. I am yours. Not because you took me, not because I have no choice, but because I choose you, always. Coda's smile was brief but fierce, a reflection of the wild, untamed land they inhabited and the fire that had always burned between them. He drew her close again, hands holding her face, lips brushing hers in a kiss that was tender, consuming, and final. In that embrace, all doubts and fears melted. The canyon, the desert, the village, they were theirs together. Every danger outside these walls could not touch the bond forged through desert nights, whispered promises, and the trials of survival. The days that followed were quieter, marked by a new intimacy between them. Clara moved through the village with more confidence, no longer merely an observer but a part of the rhythm of life. Coda taught her to ride more boldly, to track the land, to read the whispers of wind and river. Yet every night, every moment of rest was theirs alone. Desire, once forbidden and electric, now flowed freely, a bridge between their bodies and hearts. Clara discovered that surrender did not mean weakness, it meant trust, power, and the courage to embrace love in its most raw and consuming form one evening. As the sun dipped below the canyon rim, painting the sky in shades of fire, Clara and Coda stood at the edge of the cliffs overlooking the valley. The wind tugged at her hair, tugged at her cloak, tugged at the memories of a life she had left behind. Coda's hand found hers, strong and steady, and they clasped fingers in silence. The moment held more weight than any words could convey. In the distance, the desert stretched endlessly, untamed and free, yet here in each other's arms, they had found a tether, a home, a sanctuary. Clara rested her head against Coda's shoulder, listening to the steady beat of his heart, the quiet promise of protection, desire, and devotion. She understood fully now the meaning of his first whisper, "Make love to me every day, and you will never suffer again." It was not a command, nor a threat. It was a vow that he would care for her, protect her, cherish her, and love her with a fire as relentless as the desert sun. And in turn, she would give herself to him not out of fear, not out of obligation, but because her heart and soul had found their reflection in him. They belonged to one another fully, fiercely, and without hesitation. As the canyon fell into twilight, Clara and Coda turned back toward the village, their hands entwined, steps synchronized, hearts beating together. The world outside could rage, the cavalry could return, and dangers could rise. Yet nothing could break the bond that had been forged in fire, desert, desire, and whispered promises. In the heart of the canyon, amidst the wildness of the land and the rhythm of their passion, they had